What up, everyone? Professor V here, and this is a lecture for Abnormal Psychology, Chapter 3, Classification and Assessment of Abnormal Behavior. Let's go. The first topic we will cover in this chapter is how abnormal behavior patterns are classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or just DSM. The first edition of the DSM was published in 1952. The latest version, the DSM-5, was published in 2013. In the DSM, abnormal behavior patterns are classified as mental disorders. Although widely accepted by most practitioners, the DSM has been criticized for relying too much on a medical model of diagnosis. The International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, or just ICD, defines every known disease, syndrome, and disorder and compiles statistics on each. The DSM is compatible with the ICD, which is in its 10th edition and preferred by psychologists and other mental health professionals. Although the DSM system, like the medical model, treats abnormal behaviors as signs or symptoms of underlying disorders or pathologies, it does not assume that abnormal behaviors necessarily stem from biological causes or defects. The DSM is descriptive, not explanatory. It describes the diagnostic features, or in medical terms, symptoms of abnormal behaviors. It does not attempt to explain their origins or adopt any particular theoretical framework. Unlike its predecessors, the DSM-3 and the DSM-4, the DSM-5 dispenses with the multi-axis system used in these earlier versions. It attempts to include a dimensional aspect to its categorical structure. The new DSM has been criticized about the changes in diagnoses and structure. Primary issues of concern include the inclusion of many new diagnostic categories, changes in classification of mental disorders, and changes in diagnostic criteria for particular disorders. Some patterns of abnormal behavior are more commonly seen in certain cultures and rare in others. These types of abnormal behaviors are cultural-bound syndromes. There are many different culture-bound syndromes that you are probably not aware of, and that is because you do not belong to that particular culture. I'll give you a few examples not mentioned in your textbook. When Huachico is a culture-bound syndrome associated with American Indians who experience anger, withdrawal, mutism, and suicide from reaction to disappointment and interpersonal problems. Malpuesto, hex, root work, or voodoo death is a culture-bound syndrome associated with African Americans and Hispanics in which unnatural diseases and death resulting from the power of people who use evil spirits. Buffy Delaranti, I'm unsure if I said that correctly, is a culture-bound syndrome associated with Haitians in which there is a sudden outburst of aggression, agitation, associated with confusion, psychomotor excitement, and symptoms resembling brief psychotic disorder. One in particular that I am familiar with and have experienced is mal de ojo, or just ojo for short. It translates into evil eye and is caused by a person with a strong eye who admires a child without touching them. The illness is believed to occur because a spell has been placed on a child by a person who secretly admires and covets him or her. To counteract the effect of admiration, the admirer must touch the object of such strong admiration. The strong eyes are believed to heat up the child's blood, resulting in symptoms such as fever, inconsolable crying, diarrhea, vomiting, aches and pains, and gassy stomach. Mal de ojo is one of the most commonly reported folk illnesses reported by Mexican parents. Treatment consists of taking a child to a folk healer for herbal remedies and ritual cures, such as passing an egg over the body and then placing it in a bowl under the child's pillow or bed overnight. If the egg is cooked in the morning, then the child had mal de ojo. Now, if you are not of the Hispanic culture or knowledgeable of the Hispanic culture, this may sound like some kind of superstition and folk medical illness. And it probably is, but as a Hispanic, not only have I experienced the symptoms as a child, when I was treated for it, the egg was placed under my bed. And in the morning, it was cooked, like fully cooked. When I was a kid, I thought that was normal and fully believed in the ritual. As an adult, I am conflicted with the idea of ojo, but I can't say that I don't believe in it because I do. For America, there are two prominent culture-bound syndromes: anorexia nervosa and dissociative identity disorder. Anorexia is becoming more widespread, but still only prominently seen in the US. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, is also rarely seen outside of the US. We will discuss DID in a future chapter. There are many other culture-bound syndromes that you and I are not aware of. There are some more listed in your textbook on page 104 and 105. Methods of assessment must be reliable and valid. Reliability of assessment techniques is shown in various ways, including internal consistency, temporal stability, and inter-rater reliability. Validity is measured by means of content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity, which we will discuss in more depth shortly. The DSM has to be reliable because if one psychologist uses the same system for diagnosing mental illnesses, they need to come to the same conclusions for the same person. If one psychologist determines one person is suffering from schizophrenia and another psychologist determines the same person is suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, and both use the DSM would not be considered reliable and would cause confusion among the patient and clinicians. If the two psychologists arrive at the same conclusion, the DSM would then be reliable. It must be valid as well, meaning that the descriptors of specific disorders must describe the observed behavior. This allows clinicians to predict the course of the disorder or the response to treatment. While the DSM is designed to be reliable and valid, there is still some criticism on several categories of mental disorders. This is what led to revisions in the past and why it will lead to more revisions in the future. The last revision took place a few years ago, and the newest edition of the DSM was published in 2013. Again, the DSM often goes through changes as time progresses and social norms change. The last change took years to complete and is a major overhaul of the DSM. It's as if they rebooted the DSM, but they put a lot of thought into it. Unlike Sony and their Spider-Man movies, it took Sony to work with Marvel to get it right this time. Jeez. A few diagnostic systems was implemented with the DSM-5 to address clinicians' concerns and improve its effectiveness. A few new disorders were defined or redefined, such as Asperger's disorder and autistic disorder, were classified under the new category Autism Spectrum Disorder, or just ASD. We will talk more about ASD in chapter 13. Another example is the new category Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders, and the reclassification of trichotillomania into this category. More about this disorder in chapter 5. As you can see above, there is still a lot of controversy over the revised DSM. There isn't a consensus on many aspects of the DSM-5. The expansions of disorders creates problems called diagnostic inflation. It may lead to more people being labeled as suffering from a mental disorder than before. Because now some people who may not have met any diagnostic criteria before, all of a sudden do. Such as children who perform repeated temper tantrums. The old school in me just says it's growing pains. Or poorly disciplined children by the parents. But at the same time, is tantrum after tantrum after tantrum really normal? These children can now be labeled as having disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Some disorders are now more broadly labeled, such as the former Asperger's disorder being reclassified as part of a spectrum of ASD. The process of development of the DSM-5 is also criticized for the amount of psychological professionals involved in the development of the DSM, as well as other experts in the field and empirical research to back the claims of the DSM. The consequences of these criticisms can have an effect on the patients or others that are labeled with certain disorders, such as the children now labeled as disruptive mood regulation disorder. This gives physicians and parents more of a reason to medicate their children and in turn charge for medications. I don't want to come off as a conspiracy theorist that the DSM was revised to incorporate more disorders so that there are more reasons to medicate people and in turn pharmaceutical companies profit, but well, I'm just stating some of the controversies that the book talks about. Usually changes to diagnostic criteria and practices tend to have a positive impact on patients. Only time will tell if it is the case with the DSM-5. However, there is an advantage to using the DSM, the designation of specific diagnostic criteria for each disorder. It allows for clinicians to contrast and compare their client's behavior with the criteria for specific disorders and pinpoint a diagnosis. Back to reliability and validity. We discussed the basics of reliability and validity in an earlier slide. Here, we discuss the assessment of reliability and validity. How do we actually know if the DSM is reliable and valid? Internal consistency. If different parts of one assessment tool for the same symptoms yield consistent results, the assessment tool is said to have internal consistency. For example, if questions 5, 6, and 7 assess for depression on one treatment tool, and questions 22, 23, and 24 also assess for depression, and both sets of questions are correlated, the assessment tool is said to have internal consistency. Test-retest reliability would be if a test is taken and then taken another time in the future. The results would be the same or at least very similar. For example, if you were to take an IQ test and score 130, you would be labeled as highly intelligent and probably walk out of the doctor's office with all this newfound confidence in the world. What? I'm smart, motherfucker. Then you take the IQ test again and your result is an average 100. And now you're like, hey man, where'd my smartness go? Because the IQ test gave you drastically different results on multiple attempts, the IQ test does not have test-retest reliability. If you were to score the average 100 both times or 130 both times, the IQ test would then have test-retest reliability. Inter-rater reliability is an assessment method that relies on the judgment of two or more observers. For instance, if a client saw a psychologist and showed symptoms of depression, that psychologist would diagnose the client with depression based on the symptoms described in the DSM. If the client would want a second opinion and saw a different psychologist, and that one also diagnoses the client with depression based on the symptoms described in the DSM, the description of depression in the DSM would then have inter-rater reliability. The DSM has all three of these and thus is determined to be reliable. Content validity is the degree of the content of a test or measure represents the traits it is said to measure. For instance, a test is said to assess depression if the questions on the test are, number 1, what kind of dogs do you like? Number 2, what is your favorite color? And number 3, who is your favorite superhero? Now, do you think those questions assess depression? No, they don't. So, in turn, we cannot say that this test assesses depression. If a test purporting to measure depression is found to correlate highly with behaviors theoretically associated with depression, this test can be said to have content validity. Criterion validity measures how one measure predicts an outcome for another measure. A test has this type of validity if it is useful for predicting performance or behavior in another situation. An example would be when you graduate and need to take the GRE for admittance into graduate school. The GRE has been shown to predict on how well a student will perform on graduate studies, and thus the GRE has criterion validity. Construct validity is the degree to which a test measures the theoretical construct or underlying construct that it purports to measure. To begin to understand this, we must know what a construct is. It is something that we perceive as real even though it has no physical attributes. You can't touch it. Such as love. What is it physically? Don't say your heart, because your physical heart has a totally different purpose: to pump blood to your various muscles and organs of the body. So again, what is love? Don't say a hug or a kiss either, because they are what they are called: a hug or a kiss. Plus, can you hug or kiss someone you don't love? Doesn't matter if you have or haven't, but you can do it. In abnormal psychology, this could be something like anxiety. You can't touch anxiety. It is an idea that has no physical basis, but there are symptoms that, when seen, represents anxiety. So a test for anxiety must predict behaviors that would be expected given your theoretical model of anxiety in order for the test to have construct validity. If a psychological test has content criterion and construct validity, it is said to have validity. Moving on, how clinicians gather information from clients and how they assess them. The clinical interview is the most widely used method of assessment. It involves the use of a set of questions designed to elicit relevant information from people seeking treatment. Clinicians generally use a structured interview, which consists of a fairly standard series of questions to gather a wide range of information concerning presenting problems or complaints, present circumstances, and history. Some questions that may be asked in the clinical interview are questions that identify the client, such as name, age, gender, racial slash ethnicity, religion, employment, and other socio-demographic information. The client is then asked what do they perceive as the problem? Why are they there at the clinician's office? Next, a clinical interview focuses on psychosocial history or developmental history, including their education level, social and occupational history, and family relationships. Another important factor in the clinical interview is the medical and psychiatric history. Have they ever been diagnosed with any before, and if so, which ones? Lastly, if they have taken any medication for medical or psychiatric problems, are they currently taking any, and if so, which ones? Tobacco, alcohol, and other drug histories are also collected. There are 3 ways to structure a clinical interview. In an unstructured interview, the clinicians adopt their own style of questioning rather than following a format. While this seems okay, often you don't get all the necessary information. Semi-structured interviews is where the clinician follows a general outline of questions while still free to ask any questions in any particular order and to branch off into other directions to follow up on important information. Structured interviews are interviews that follow a preset series of questions in a particular order. They provide the highest level of reliability in reaching diagnostic judgments because they allow for the clinicians to get all necessary information because of the preset questions you have to ask have been thought out. In addition to the clinical interview, a clinician may also assess the client's cognitive functioning. It is called a mental status examination. Some of the questions are not directly asked to the client, such as appearance, including clothing, hygiene, prosthetic devices, height, weight, age, appearance, gait, and posture. Other things that are assessed in the mental status examinations are mood, attention level, thought processes, orientation, memory, comprehension, abstracting ability, insight, and judgment. Some of these things are measured by asking the client to perform certain behaviors, and others are silent and judgments are passed by the qualified clinician. Other assessments used by clinicians are various psychological tests. Psychological tests take years, sometimes decades, to develop to ensure reliability and validity. Depending on the test itself, they are designed to evaluate intelligence, personality, psychological disorders, and the unconscious. They are standardized, meaning that no matter who the test is given to, it is always given in the same order. Now, no follow-up questions are asked unless they are allowed by the test. By research on these tests, clinicians know what is normal or what is a normal answer for certain age groups and what is considered abnormal. They allow clinicians to predict criterion variables such as underlying conditions or future outcomes. One type of psychological test is the intelligence test. Tests of intelligence, like the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler scales, are used for various purposes in clinical assessment, including determining evidence of mental retardation. Ooh, I don't like using that term. Some may find it offensive and a derogatory term. Why? Well, think about how we use the word retarded these days. Dude, why are you trying to lick your elbow? Dude, that's retarded. Or, bro, you seriously can't tell time? Dog, you got a digital watch, dog, you retarded. And please don't tell me you tried licking your elbow earlier. And if you did you... So as you can see, it is now used to signify stupidity. Thus, it can be demeaning and offensive. So using the word retarded in a retarded way is retarded. Don't do it. But seriously, if you can lick your elbow, show me. I'll give you extra credit. So instead, let's use the term learning disabled. Tests of intelligence, like the Stanford Binet and the Richter scales, are used for various purposes in clinical assessments, including determining evidence of a learning disability or cognitive impairment, and assessing strengths and weaknesses. Intelligence is expressed in the form of an intelligence quotient, IQ. The debate on intelligence is still a hot one. What is it exactly? Well, the general answer is the ability to understand and adapt or cope with the environment in which we live. Kind of vague, but acceptable. The most commonly used IQ test is the Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS, developed by David Wechsler. The WAIS uses various tests to arrive on an IQ score. It assesses comprehension level, arithmetic, similarities, digit span, memory, vocabulary, ability to complete a picture in a storyboard, ability to arrange blocks to make a pattern, certain pattern, and letter number sequencing. More on these in the next slide. The average IQ score is 100, with 130 to be highly intelligent and 140 is considered a genius, while 70 and below is considered learning disabled or intelligently deficient. The IQ score is based on the relative difference or deviation of a person's score on an intelligence test from the norms for the person's age group. So if a 20-year-old answers a question like a typical 20-year-old, they are said to have an average IQ. The typical answers take years to research and may change with time. Interesting fact, even though IQ tests were not invented in his time, it is believed that Leonardo da Vinci would have the highest IQ of any person to walk the earth. It is estimated anywhere between 190 to well over 220. So here is table 3.5, which can be found on page 114 of your textbook. These are several sample questions that are asked in the WAIS. Block design and picture completion are shown in figure 3.1, which can be found on page 115 of your textbook. For those who are watching for fun, Google WAIS block design or WAIS picture completion to see examples, and that's WAIS. Other psychological tests include test over personality. One type of personality tests are objective tests. These are self-report, meaning you are giving a series of questions and you answer the questions on your own. These tests are considered objective in the sense that they make use of a limited range of possible responses to items on an empirical or objective method of test construction. They measure personality traits such as emotional stability or instability, masculinity, femininity, and introversion, etc. They respond to questions or statements about their feelings, thoughts, concerns, attitudes, interests, beliefs, and the like. The answers to these questions are usually true-false, or a Likert scale such as 1 always, 2 sometimes, 3 never, etc. Two of the most commonly used objective tests are the MMPI-2 and the MCMI. The MMPI-2 is used to assess abnormal behavior and assist clinicians in diagnosing these disorders. It is a pretty long test too. It consists of 567 questions. Yikes. There are several individual scales scattered throughout the test that assess for various abnormal behaviors. There are security questions or validity scales in there as well to be sure that the client is paying attention to the test or trying to have a favorable or unfavorable results. There are a few questions that are on the MMPI-2 that assess for a particular scale in the next two slides. Again, these are some of the questions that are asked on the MMPI-2 to assess several different scales. The question is in the third column and participants answer true or false to the questions. The MMPI-2 tests for the traits in the fourth column, which are symptoms associated with the disorders in the second column. Here are a few more questions seen on the MMPI-2. You can pause the video to read or read them in your textbook on page 117. The MCMI is another personality assessment which focuses solely on personality disorders, which is in its third edition. The MMPI-2, in contrast, focuses on personality traits associated with other psychological disorders. Clinicians may use both the MMPI-2 along with the MCMI to capture a wider range of personality traits. Objective tests are easy to administer because once the client understands the instructions, they can complete the test unattended. They often answer questions that the clinical interview fails to answer or information you cannot gather from just watching their behavior. Objective tests often answer questions on the client's thought processes. For example, clinicians may learn that a client holds negative self-perceptions about themselves which may not come across as obvious in a clinical interview. Clinicians find value in both the clinical interview and using objective testing and thus often use both to help determine mental health functioning. Projective tests are a lot different from intelligence and objective testing. There is no clear set of possible responses. The word projective is used because these personality tests derive from the psychodynamic belief that people impose or project their own psychological needs, drives, and motives, much of which lie in the unconscious, onto their interpretations of ambiguous stimuli. The thing is, critics of projective tests believe that the results of projective testing is based on the clinician's interpretation of test response rather than the client themselves. There are two prominent projective tests, the Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test, or TAT for short. The Rorschach ink blot test, hey, stop doing that. Sorry if you don't know who that is. His name is Rorschach. And he is a character in the comic Watchmen, which is a phenomenal book. Highly recommend reading, but first, read your textbook, people. Anywho, you may have seen this test before in all kinds of media, but it is an actual test used by clinicians. They interpret personality and underlying thoughts by showing the client the ink block and asking what do they see. Depending on the answer, it may suggest to the clinician normal or abnormal thought patterns. Rorschach ink blots can also distinguish underlying traits or conflicts the person may be having unconsciously. Such as if the client sees movements in the ink blocks, this is suggestive of intelligence and creativity. If a person cannot distinguish if the ink blocks are male or female, it may suggest that the client is in question of their own gender identity. The TAT is also a projective test that involves pictures that are shown to clients. However, they are less ambiguous than the Rorschach ink blocks, but still ambiguous enough that clients can have different answers for the same picture. It consists of a series of cards that depict a scene, and the client is asked to describe what is happening in the scene. It is assumed that the client's responses to the cards will reflect their experiences and outlooks on life and perhaps shed light on their deep-seated needs and conflicts. Two examples of the TAT are on the following slide. Psychodynamic theorists believe that clients will project underlying psychological needs and conflicts into their responses toward the scenes. Their answers may also show how clients interpret, behave, or think in similar situations that are depicted in the scenes. Now it's time for the best two words that any student can possibly hear. Am I right? Extra credit! Yeah! So here are two pictures that are similar to those seen on the TAT. Type out, or TAT, type out a story of what is happening in both the scenes. Describe the events that led up to the scene and how it will turn out. Bring them to class and hand them in to me, and we will discuss them in class. The extra credit will go towards your first exam. You may be thinking right now, there has to be a lot of criticisms behind projective testing. And you'd be right. There is. One of the hottest debates is standardization. There is no clear set of responses that the client must make, and there is no definitive interpretations for clinicians to reference to for the same response. One clinician may interpret the response one way, while another clinician may interpret it another. Granted, psychologists are the only type of clinicians, along with trained psychiatrists, that can give projective testing, at least in Texas anyway, and they are highly trained on how to interpret the results, but there is still a probability that they will interpret the same results differently. And because of this, critics argue that projective testing lacks validity. Moving on to other types of testing. As we all know, the brain controls our behavior and cognition. Where there is damage, this may cause neurological damage, which in turn can cause abnormal behaviors. Neurological assessments can determine if the causes of abnormal behavior stems from neurological damage. When a behavior is suspected to be a result of neurological impairment, a neurological evaluation is requested for the client, who then visits a neurologist for further testing. However, they may also see a clinical neuropsychologist who is qualified to administer neuropsychological assessments, such as other types of psychological testing, to reveal signs of brain damage. Again, methods of neuropsychological assessment help determine organic basis for impaired behavior and psychological functioning. The Bender VisualMotor Gestalt test requires subjects to reproduce 9 geometric designs on a piece of paper. Clients are asked to copy different shapes and designs as directed by the psychologist. A sample can be seen on page 121 of your textbooks. You can also Google Bender VisualMotor Gestalt test examples. When the client is asked to draw these items and they are distorted, it can be indicative of neurological damage. Also, they are then asked to draw the images from memory, because neurological damage can impair memory functioning. The Halstead Ratan neuropsychological battery is a more sophisticated test measuring various perceptual, intellectual, and motor skills and performance. There are 3 subtests to the Halstead Ratan that measure different abilities. The category subtest assesses abstract thinking ability as indicated by an individual's proficiency at forming principles or categories that relate different stimuli to one another. Performance on the test is believed to reflect functioning in the frontal lobes and cerebral cortex. The rhythm subtest is a test of concentration and attention. The client listens to 30 pairs of recorded beats and indicates whether the beats in each pair are the same or different. Performance deficits are associated with damage to the right temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. The tactual performance subtest examines visual memory. The client is blindfolded and is asked to fit wooden blocks of different shapes into corresponding depressions on a foam board. Afterward, the subject draws the board from memory as a measure of visual memory. In behavioral assessment, test responses are taken as samples of behavior rather than occur in specific situations than as signs of underlying traits or dispositions. According to the behavioral approach, behavior is primarily determined by environmental or situational factors such as stimulus cues and reinforcements, not by underlying traits. The behavioral examiner may conduct a functional assessment which relates the problem behavior to its antecedents and consequences. Knowledge of the environmental conditions in which a problem occurs may help the therapist work with the client and the family to change the conditions that trigger and maintain it. The clinician may also conduct a behavioral interview in which they pose questions to learn more about the history and situational aspects of the problem behavior, more so than the clinical interview. Self-monitoring is another behavioral technique in which the client acts as the clinician in a certain point of view. They are responsible for recording their own behaviors, thoughts, and emotions, and assume the responsibility for assessing the problem behavior in the settings in which it naturally occurs. They can do this by using a journal or diary of some sort. The client can read the behaviors they are engaging in and try to either cope with or stop the behavior altogether. In analog measures, clients are asked to role play as if they are in real life situations that cause certain behavior to occur. The clinicians give them a scenario and the client is asked to state how they would respond in that situation. For example, suppose a client is dealing with social anxiety. A clinician states to the client, "You are on your way to your office at the top floor of your building. When you exit the elevator, you see a large gathering with coworkers and supervisors having a holiday lunch in the lobby, which you have to cross to get to your office. What do you do?" The client's answer of what he would do may reveal deficits and severity of the social anxiety which can be addressed in therapy sessions. The behavioral approach is a widely used analog measure which is used to get over fears. This is exposure therapy where the client is exposed to the stimulus such as a snake that causes fear. They slowly adapt to the snake and is eventually able not only to get close but even pet the snake with no anxiety symptoms. Behavioral rating scales are checklists for frequency, intensity, and range of problem behaviors. They are often filled out by parents to help assessing children's problem behaviors. A clinician can compare the child's score on several dimensions of behavior with norms based on samples of others who are the same age as the child. Cognitive assessment focuses on the measurements of thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes in order to help identify distorted and self-defeating thinking patterns. Specific methods of assessment include the use of a thought record or diary and the use of rating scales such as the Automatic Thoughts Questionnaire, or ATQ, and the Dysfunctional Attitude Scale, or DAS. A journal or diary will help with recording dysfunctional thoughts and will help clients identify thought patterns connected with troubling emotional states. The ATQ 30 asks clients to rate both frequency and strength of belief of 30 automatic negative thoughts. Some questions they are asked to respond to are 1. I don't think I can go on. 2. I hate myself. And 3. I've let people down. A total score is obtained by summing the frequencies of occurrence of each item. Higher scores are indicative of depression. The DAS assesses underlying attitudes or assumptions associated with depression. Questions like, I feel like I'm nothing if someone I love doesn't love me back, are answered using a 7-point Likert scale. It is useful in detecting vulnerability to depression. Here are several items that are similar to those found on the ATQ. They represent some of the negative thoughts that may go through one's mind if they are feeling depressed. Clinicians use the results to determine severity and help with replacing the negative thoughts with rational alternative thoughts. Lastly are physiological measurements. Physiological measurements assess physical responses that may be associated with abnormal behavior. Measures of physiological function include heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin responses or GSR, muscle tension, and brain wave activity. Brain imaging techniques such as EEG, CAT scans, PET scans or PET scans, MRI, and fMRIs probe the inner workings and structures of the brain. GSR measures the amount of electricity that passes through 2 points of the skin, usually the hand. Researchers assume the person's anxiety level correlates with the amount of electricity conducted across the skin. EMGs monitors muscles tension through sensors attached to targeted muscle groups. They can indicate muscle tension associated with tension headaches. EEGs measure brain waves by attaching electrodes to the scalp of a person. Certain brain waves indicate certain mental states such as relaxation and different stages of sleep. They are also used to examine brain wave patterns associated with schizophrenia, brain damage, and even tumors. CT scans, also called CAT scans, look at brain shape and structure. They reveal abnormalities in brain shape and structures that may suggest lesions, blood clots, or tumors. PET scans are used to study the various functioning parts of the brain. It has been used to see which area of the brain are functioning when we perform certain cognitive functions. And lastly, fMRIs. It tracks the demands for oxygen in the brain, which reveal levels of activity or engagement during particular tasks. Lastly, for Chapter 3 are sociocultural and ethnic factors in assessment of psychological disorders. Clinicians also need to recognize that assessment techniques that may be reliable and valid in one culture may not be in another, even when they are translated accurately. Researchers need to disentangle psychopathology from sociocultural factors so as not to introduce cultural bias in assessment. Meanings can be lost or distorted in translation. For example, Spanish speakers are often judged to be more disturbed when interviewed in English than in Spanish. And this wraps up Chapter 3's lecture. If you have any questions over the content, please leave a comment below or email me. If you are in my class, please let me know in class, because I am pretty sure if you have a question over the material, others also have the same question. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next lecture. Dang it, not you again, Rorschach. Dr. Manhattan, are you there? Thank God. Please, can you get rid of Rorschach already?
I understand.
Out of my way.
You know I can't let you do that.
If you'd cared from the start, none of this would have happened.
Whoa, I didn't mean... Whoops.